Hello everyone and welcome back to Intellectual Potluck. It has been a while, but we are back, and by we I mean me, because it is just me here today. I wanted to shake things up a bit this year, and that's why I'm a bit late releasing a new episode, because I had a new idea that I wanted to do, and it took a bit of time to put together, because my brain's slow. So instead of doing what we have been doing, which was the unpopular opinions, what I wanted to move towards was doing a bit more investigating and answering some of the questions that we have about various different topics, and basically just trying to learn things. One of my big goals for this year was to doom scroll less and to actually engage my brain and try and engage with content that is a bit less brain rotty. And I thought it would be really hypocritical if I then didn't emulate that in the content that I'm putting out there too. So this is what I'm doing. We'll see how it goes, see what you guys think, and if it's a flop, at least I gave it a go, right? I'm really sorry if you guys can hear a chomping sound. I had to give Arlo a carrot to calm him down, but anyway. To anyone who caught the last episode of last year that I did with my friend Amy, you know that we were talking about degrees and how we both have history degrees that we've never actually used. And I made a bit of a joke about how I should use my degree on the podcast and do something history related. And that joke kind of just stuck in my mind and I couldn't shake it. And so this is where it's ended up. I wanted to do some history-based content using my knowledge and using some research and cover topics that I find interesting and that hopefully you guys will find interesting. But as well as these, I am also still going to do some of the interview-style content, and I'm going to talk to people about things that they find interesting and that they know a lot about and, ask them questions, see what we can learn together, see what they can teach me, all kinds of things. So for the history stuff, I spent a long time trying to figure out where to start, and my brain's not very good at doing things random. So I was like, okay, it's history, so chronological makes sense, but then I don't want to start at the dawn of history because then it'll take me forever to get to the juicy stuff, which is what I'm really interested in. So what I decided on instead was that I would pick a date in history, which would ideally be the date that I release an episode, though I'm not going to promise to be infallible on that, and choose something that happened on that date and base an episode around it. So this episode is hopefully going out on January 30th. It is also being recorded on January 30th because I had a recording and the audio was terrible, so yeah, we're going to see how that goes. We'll see how quick I can edit. But January 30th is a really interesting place to start because it is also the anniversary of when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. So this is where we're going to start, and this is the first topic that we're going to start on, because this is also one of the first things that I studied when I first started studying history, and it's a really, really interesting space. And it feels kind of relevant right now as well, because certain public figures who are doing certain hand gestures that are associated with this time period that they shouldn't be doing. But we're not going to go into that, we're going to focus on the past. So for this, I'm not going to talk so much about Hitler's time in power and the Nazi regime. I'm going to be focusing on the lead up and how he ended up in that position of power in the first place, because I know when I first started studying Nazi Germany, that was one of my biggest questions, how did this happen? How did this person get into this position? So that's what we're going to do. And eventually down the road with the YouTube videos, I'm hoping that I'll be able to do animations and stuff, but given that I'm recording and publishing this all in one day, probably not going to happen for this one, but if anyone has any advice on how to do that, I'd be really grateful because I don't actually know how to do that. I'm just adding another thing to my list. I need to stop doing that. Okay, so what we need to know is that everything with Nazi Germany stemmed from the fact that Germany was in a massive time of crisis. The Nazi power and influence grew in a time that was a huge period of political and economic instability in Germany, and all of that stems originally from World War I. So right at the end of World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm, and I'm going to apologise in advance for my pronunciations on anything, let's just go with it. Kaiser Wilhelm abdicated and he fled to Holland once he could see what was coming. He could see that the tide had turned. He had lost a lot of the support of his people. So he fled on November 9th. And as we know, the armistice for World War I happened on November 11th, so very quick turnover, and Germany had to very quickly in this time period establish a new form of government. So they created a government structure which was based around having a president, a chancellor, and then the Reichstag. So the president was elected by popular vote, and then the president appointed the Chancellor. And then the Reichstag was done by election, a bit similar to how we do members of parliament and things like that. But it is important to note that whilst the president is popular vote and the Reichstag is popular vote, the Chancellor is appointed by the president. As far as I know, they could kind of choose whoever they wanted, but it was a smart political move to choose the leader of the party that was most popular in the Reichstag. Otherwise, they would lose the support of the Reichstag. Or to have a leader form a coalition so that they then became the majority. And so this democratic system was very, very left-wing compared to what Germany had had in the past. And this wasn't always met with positivity from both politicians and civilians. So there were certain things put into place to allow authoritarian rule if there was a state of emergency or major problems, such as Article 48, where the president has the power to assume emergency powers and essentially bypass the Reichstag in the circumstances of an emergency. This time where they were establishing the new government, it was a very up and down time. Some people were very in support of it, but there was a lot of uncertainty because it was so different from what they'd done before. There was a lot of very short tempers in this time and a lot of political unrest, but they were trying to make it work. They had to find something to make it work to get through this incredibly difficult period. So while they were working on this, we jump ahead to 1919 and the Treaty of Versailles, which was signed. And the Treaty of Versailles imposed a lot of severe reparations and consequences for Germany as a result of World War I. So they had to pay $33 billion in war reparations, and Germany also had to give up some of its prized overseas colonies and surrender parts of their land to France and Poland. As a result of this, Germany lost 13% of its territory, including areas which accounted for 16% of their coal production and 48% of their iron ore production. So this did have a really severe impact on the German economy and German resources. And the German army was, of course, radically downsized, and the nation was forbidden to have submarines or an air force. And all of that is not even to say, for the massive loss of human life that they had as a result of World War I. So all of these things put together really meant that Germany was under a very tight squeeze. And Geddes, I think I'm pronouncing that right, who's a British politician, he very famously said, "We shall squeeze the German lemon until the pips squeak," which is just a very British way of saying we're going to get as much blood out of the stone as we possibly can. And so all of this is to say that things were very, very difficult for Germany in this time. So in the late 1910s, and the 1920s, Germany was facing these very severe consequences that it didn't necessarily have the means to follow. There was a lot of economic strain and morale in the country was incredibly low. And this all kind of came to a peak in 1923. Germany was pretty much out of money. They could not afford to make their reparation payments, and as a result, France and Belgium invaded the Ruhr, which is an area of Germany which contains a lot of their factories. And France and Belgium then occupied the Ruhr, meaning Germany then had limited access to its resources and its factories. And goods became incredibly difficult to obtain for people. And what happens when goods are very difficult to obtain is they become very expensive. We've seen this in the modern day too, where we can't get something, and so then when it comes into stock, it's 10 times the price it would normally be. So the result of this, and then the excessive printing of money that Germany was doing to try and combat this issue, was that Germany was facing massive hyperinflation. I can't even explain how much it got out of control. We think inflation is bad now, and it is absolutely nothing compared to what Germany went through in this time. So to give you some numbers, something that cost 250 marks in January of 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November of 1923. So in the space of less than a year, things had increased a billionfold, almost. And so people couldn't afford basics like bread. Their life savings was suddenly worthless. It was a really bad time. So it became very, very clear in 1923 that some major changes needed to be made to the economy. And I'm not going to get too bogged down in the details here because there is a lot that went into it, but suffice to say, some German leaders, along with some American leaders, came together and they put together what was known as the Dawes Plan, named after Mr. Dawes. And this plan was basically just to try and get Germany out of this hole and combat the hyperinflation. So the first part of the plan was that Germany had to restart its reparation payments to France and Belgium because they needed to get France and Belgium out of the Ruhr. So they did this, France and Belgium left, and they were able to access those resources again, easing some of the strain. But in order to afford those reparation payments that they hadn't been able to afford, they introduced a whole new currency, which was the Reichsmark. Germany was then loaned 800 million Reichsmarks to form the base capital for their new bank and to try and ensure the Reichsmark's stability. And about half of that money came from US Wall Street bonds. So the economy was still bad, but they had a plan, they had a new system, and they were getting support from the US and other countries so that they could afford to keep things going whilst also making their reparation payments. And these reparation payments were also eased. So they were given a longer term to pay them off over, and the amount that they had to pay was set to gradually increase so that it went up as the German economy restabilized. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of these steps were very successful. There was still a lot of problems politically and a lot of things going on behind the scenes, which we'll get into in a bit, but economically and culturally, Germany was in a much better place. And the Weimar Republic, which is what we call this time period from the end of World War I to 1933, the Weimar Republic entered its golden age. We noticed some very significant cultural changes during this time. So the Weimar Republic had a very progressive attitude towards things like women's rights. So all men and women over the age of 20 were given the right to vote. Sexual liberation was a very real phenomenon in this period, with gay and lesbian rights movements, which were led by Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, who ran an institute for sexual science. And culturally, Germany was just in a much better place than it had been in a very long time. Because remember, before all of this drama, they were in World War I. It was not a good time. So things were finally starting to look up. It wasn't perfect, but it was the most stable that we would see the Republic be. But unfortunately, this whole system was like a big house of cards, and there was a massive shove coming its way. In 1929, when the Wall Street crash happened, everything very quickly fell apart. America could no longer offer its support and had to recall a lot of the loans that they'd made to Germany, and Germany was hit with yet another massive financial crisis. Businesses closed, mass employment. It was honestly a disaster. And where financial crises and mass unemployment hit, very often civil and political unrest are not far behind. And what also happens when situations like this arise is people lose faith in their political leaders. People had lost faith in the Republic, which then paved the way for some of the more extreme parties in Germany to get their voices more prominent. And so this leads us very nicely into the rise of the Nazi Party. So as I said, people were leaning more towards these more extreme parties. The Nazi Party had been around since 1920, but their influence had always been relatively limited. Most notably, they had a failed coup in 1923 known as the Beer Hall Putsch, where they had effectively tried to start a revolution, which failed. After the coup, Hitler was actually arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He then only served 9 months, but I guess that's what happens when you're in a position of power. So this failed coup taught the Nazi Party that they weren't going to overthrow the current system through revolution or unrest. They had to change their tactics, they had to get organized, they had to be strategic, and they had to infiltrate from the ground up. So then started pursuing more legal ways of achieving power. And while the party was not overly popular during the 1920s, that does not mean by any means that they were idle. So they spent a lot of this time reforming what's known as the SA, or the brown shirts. I can't pronounce the German name, so I'll just put it on the screen for any people who are watching. But this group was largely made up of ex-soldiers, people who had fought against the more left-wing views of the Weimar Republic. This group were known for being quite violent, and they were used by the Nazi Party as their numbers grew to protect party meetings, attend rallies, and quite often intimidate and assault their political rivals as well. They became basically a miniature army. And I do say miniature in a very loose way because there are reports that at times, because of the limits on the German army, the SA actually became a very competitive size. So in the 1920s, we have a political party that may not be the largest, but they do have a sizable military presence behind them and a lot of very passionate, very angry voices behind them. So when you pile onto that the problems that the Weimar Republic were having, it very much paved the way for the people who were skeptical of the Republic to become more vocal. And as we know, Hitler himself was very charismatic. He was a very good public speaker and very persuasive. Hitler's natural charisma combined with the Nazi Party's propaganda, which was vast. They used, radio, posters, newspapers, just trying to reach as many people as possible. And they were able to feed on this national discontent that had built up and create this image of Hitler as the great, powerful, stable leader that Germany needed to get through this difficult time. And remember, democracy had been a relatively new thing for Germany, and there was a lot of people who still believed that it was not the right way forward. And these people had a lot of influence, and some of them were very happy to back the Nazi Party. The party knew who their supporters would be, and they targeted them directly. War veterans, unemployed workers, middle-class conservatives, rural workers. They knew who their target demographic was and tailored their message to address the things that would influence them the most. And a big part of this was in creating common enemies. Creating a common enemy can be a very powerful tool in persuasion and manipulation. Hitler and the Nazis were building a big base of anti-communism and anti-Semitic and ultra-nationalist messages. And given how desperate and angry so much of the population was, particularly following 1929 and the massive economic depression that Germany fell into, people were desperate and people were willing to jump onto some more toxic ideologies to explain away or try and find a solution for the terrible situation that they found themselves in. The Nazis were promising economic growth, more job opportunities, and stability, blaming communists, Jews, and the Weimar Republic for all of Germany's misfortunes. So now that we have a bit more of an idea of the mindset of the people of Germany and of the Nazi Party, let's have a look at specifically how Hitler came into power, because it's not as simple as he was just voted in. So the Nazis did see a very, very rapid growth. So to give you some numbers and comparisons, in 1928 they won just 2.6% of the vote, gaining them 12 seats in the Reichstag. And then in September 1930, the Nazi Party won 18.3% of the vote, which was 107 seats. It was a massive increase, and it made them the second largest party in the Reichstag at that time. And by July 1932, the Nazis won 37.3% of the vote, which was 203 seats, and they became the largest party in the Reichstag. And I do want to mention that although the Nazi Party had a lot of support by this time, there were also those who were very outspokenly against them. Because of the extreme views of the Nazi Party, you did get the extreme opinions of both sides. As we've seen in some modern day politics, people become very passionate when you're talking about the extremes. So Hitler is now the leader of the party that has the most votes in the Reichstag. But remember, this does not automatically make him Chancellor, because the Chancellor is chosen by the President. The President at the time was President Hindenburg, and in 1932 he decided he didn't want to appoint Hitler Chancellor. He was allegedly fearful of Hitler's more extreme views and didn't trust him. They didn't get on. So he appointed Franz von Papen, who did not last very long. He tried to make some changes. They didn't work. They flopped. And he was effectively forced out by Kurt von Schleicher, who flopped even harder. He didn't even last 2 months. That then led us to January of 1933. And given the two failed chancellors in very quick succession, President Hindenburg was facing a lot of pressure to appoint Hitler. And so that's what he did. In January of 1933, Hitler was appointed chancellor. And as we know, that was the beginning of the end. But that's not the whole story when it comes to how that led to him having such authoritarian power, because remember, the president sits over him and he still has the Reichstag behind him. So we're going to delve a bit further into what happened after he became chancellor that led to this authoritarian control. So initially, after appointing him, President Hindenburg and the conservative elites believed that they could use Hitler's influence, but also rein him in and control him. we know this isn't the truth of what happened, and things very, very, very quickly spiraled. On the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag building of the German parliament caught fire, and acting as Chancellor, Hitler immediately blamed this on the communists. He said that they started the fire as an attempt to overthrow the German government, but Hitler used this justification to declare a state of emergency and enact the Reichstag fire decree. This decree allowed him to abolish most civil liberties, including the right to speak, the right to assemble, the right to protest, and the right to due process. So it was pretty major, but remember, the German government had been set up so that in the case of a state of emergency, they could do this. And so this happened at the end of February, and 6 days later was the March 1933 election. In the months leading up to this election, the Nazi Party had been going hard with a widespread campaign of violence, where the SA were targeting the Communist Party, left-wingers, trade unionists, the Social Democratic Party, and the Centre Party. And even during the election itself, there were reports of Nazi Party members monitoring the voting process. And the result was that the Nazi Party did see an increase in popularity, but they still weren't able to get a majority. So they ended up forming a coalition with the German National People's Party to form a majority government in the Reichstag. Within the same month, he put into place the Malicious Practices Act, which was a law that meant even the smallest expression of political dissent became a crime. And if you were accused of doing these things, you could be sent to prison and later to a concentration camp. This act also allowed people who were deemed as social outcasts, such as homosexuals, Jews, political rivals, to be punished by the law. And then only a few weeks later, Hitler submitted a proposal for the Enabling Act. And this was a very powerful act. If it was passed, it would give the cabinet, and by extension Hitler, all legislative control. And there's some debate among historians on how this act was passed, but I think it's fair to say that given the political tension, the physical intimidation, and also the fact that it had literally become illegal to speak out politically against the Nazi Party, that's why it got passed. And also people were scared. The Reichstag fire had been declared a state of emergency. People believed that they were in a state of emergency. So they were scared. They wanted someone to take control. So the act was passed. The Social Democratic Party voted against it, and as a result, a lot of them went into hiding straight after the vote. But another thing that came from this act was that it allowed Hitler to create concentration camps. And basically, the combined power of the Enabling Act and the Reichstag fire decree transformed the government into a legal dictatorship. President Hindenburg no longer had any real power. He was still president, but he had no power to do anything. The power sat with the cabinet and the chancellor. So they used this power to dismantle their political rivals, including those that they were in a coalition with. And by mid-July, the Nazi Party was the only political party in Germany. And look, this is not to say that there was no resistance to the Nazi regime. There was. But remember just how illegal it had become, and that you were risking your life by doing this. So the power of the SA and the SS meant that people were very, very afraid to speak out. And then you have events such as the Night of the Long Knives, which was in 1934, where there was mass assassinations of political rivals and other potential threats. People could see how dangerous it was to oppose the new order. So those who weren't in support may not have been willing to risk their lives to challenge it. And then the final nail in this already pretty tight coffin was when President Hindenburg died in August of 1934. After his death, Hitler assumed full control. He absorbed the presidency and the chancellorship into one role, becoming the Führer and Reichskanzler, basically meaning that he had unilateral control. And that's it. That's how this all came to be. I may go more into the Third Reich in the future, but I really just wanted to cover this portion on how he came into power and how this all happened. Because like I say, when I first was studying it, this was something I really struggled to get my head around. But you can see every step of the way, like how things spiraled and how people were presented with a solution to a terrible situation that they were in. And a lot of the red flags, maybe they couldn't see them until it was too late and until they no longer had the control or the power to be able to say no. But this is a very, very broad overview. There are so many things in this that we could go into way more detail on. And I'm more than happy to. Let me know in the comments or in my messages if you want me to go deeper into any particular part of this. It is such an interesting period of history, and I hope you guys found it interesting too. I really loved putting my history hat back on and researching this and trying to put it all together. So I'm really, really excited to explore some more topics. But yeah, drop me a comment or a message on socials if there's anything that you'd like to cover, or if there's anything that I've got wrong or misconstrued, because there's so many voices and so much research around Nazi Germany, and there's a lot of people who know a hell of a lot more than me, so by all means, please let me know. Our next episode is going to be one of the interview episodes. I'm not entirely sure which one yet. We've got a couple lined up which I'm really excited by, that are really interesting, so be sure to join us for that, and I will see you all next time. Bye.